In the year 1421, the largest fleet on Earth was not European. It was Chinese. Hundreds of ships, 30,000 sailors, treasure junks the size of small towns. And then, almost overnight, that fleet was burned, and China turned away from the sea. But what if those ships had not been burned? What if instead of turning inward, the Ming had pointed their bows east, across the Pacific, toward an entire continent no Chinese map had ever drawn? This is what that world might have looked like. Start with the real history, because this only works if you understand what actually happened. Between 1405 and 1433, the eunuch admiral Zheng He led 7 enormous voyages across the Indian Ocean. His fleet reached Vietnam, India, the Persian Gulf, and East Africa. He brought back giraffes, ambassadors, and tribute, and he commanded ships unlike anything Europe would build for another 400 years. The largest treasure ships were over 400 feet long, 9 masts, watertight bulkheads, compasses, stern post rudders, gunpowder weapons. By every metric that mattered in 1430, this was the most advanced navy on the planet. Then in 1424, the Yongle Emperor died. His successors saw the voyages as wasteful. The treasury was bleeding, the Mongols were threatening the northern border, and Confucian officials had always disliked the eunuch admiral and his expensive fleet. By 1433, the voyages stopped. The shipyards were dismantled, the records were burned. Eventually, it became a capital crime to build an ocean-going ship with more than 2 masts. China, by choice, removed itself from the sea. Now, the pivot. Imagine a different succession. Imagine the Yongle Emperor's grandson, the young Xuande, listens to his admirals instead of his bureaucrats. The fleet is not burned, it is reassigned. East, into the unknown Pacific, hunting new tribute lands. The Pacific is wider than the Atlantic, far wider, but Chinese sailors already know how to follow currents and trade winds. The Kuroshio Current sweeps north past Japan and bends east across open ocean toward what we now call North America. By 1435, an exploratory squadron of 20 treasure ships sails east of Japan. Most do not come home. Storms, scurvy, lost reckoning. But the second wave, in 1438, sights land. Forested cliffs, dark green pine, gray pebble beaches. The coast of what we now call Oregon or Northern California. They go ashore for water and meet one of the coastal nations already living there. Imagine that first contact. A Chinese officer in lacquered armor steps onto a beach where coastal villagers are smoking salmon over open fires. Neither side has any framework for the other. There is no shared language, no shared world. Unlike the Spanish in our timeline, the Chinese expedition is not here to conquer. They are here to map, to gather tribute, and to demonstrate the reach of the emperor. Their orders are explicit: survey, trade, return. And here is the first asymmetry. The Aztecs and Inca in our world were destroyed in part by surprise. The Chinese arrival is not a surprise to its own captains. They plan, supply, document, and come back. By 1445, regular voyages connect Ming ports to a string of small trading posts along the Pacific coast of North America. Wooden stockades, jetties, storehouses, not settler colonies, more like Portuguese factory ports. And now the disease question, because in any first contact, this is the engine that decides everything else. In our timeline, European pathogens killed up to 90% of indigenous Americans in the century after Columbus. Chinese contact is catastrophic too. The Ming carry smallpox, measles, influenza. If anything, the disease load is heavier, because Ming China trades with half of Eurasia. But the rhythm is different. Smaller landings. Fewer Chinese on the coast at any time. No silver-driven mass migration. The disease still spreads, but the death curve is slower. Some communities collapse. Others have time to adapt, isolate, and survive. Zoom out to 1470. Ming trading posts now run from what we would call Vancouver Island down to the Baja Peninsula. They are not numerous, maybe a few thousand Chinese settlers across the entire coast. But the trade goods flowing back to China are extraordinary. Sea otter pelts, cedar timber, smoked salmon, obsidian, and eventually gold from the rivers of the Sierra Nevada. The Yongle Emperor's old dream of the fleet paying for itself becomes, for the first time, actually real. Word travels inland. The Pueblo peoples hear of strangers on the coast. The Mississippian mound builders hear it through trade chains. And around 1480, the rumor reaches Tenochtitlan. Now imagine the meeting we did not get in our timeline. A Ming embassy travels overland with native guides, climbs the high passes, descends into the Valley of Mexico. They walk into Tenochtitlan, a city of 200,000 people, more populous than any city in Europe. No Spaniard has ever seen this city. Cortez is not even born yet. The first foreign drawings of Tenochtitlan come not from conquistadors, but from Ming court painters carrying brushes, not arquebuses. The Aztec emperor receives the embassy in the Great Palace. The Chinese envoys present silk, porcelain, jade, and a written letter from the Son of Heaven on the other side of the world. The Aztec court responds with cocoa, gold, feathered cloaks, and codices. It is, by any measure, the most consequential meeting in the history of either civilization. And both sides treat it that way. The Aztecs are not crushed, they are visited. There is a difference, and that difference rewrites the next 4 centuries. Ming China is now the dominant outside power in the Americas. Not a settler empire, a trade empire. They want gold, exotic goods, and the prestige of distant tribute. They do not want to farm Iowa. They do not need to. Meanwhile, Europe is doing what Europe was doing in 1480. Reconquering Iberia, fighting in Italy, trying to reach India around Africa. Columbus is a young sailor in Genoa, dreaming of a route west. When Columbus does eventually sail west, in 1492 or thereabouts, he no longer arrives at an unknown world. He arrives at a Caribbean already aware that strangers exist. Chinese trade goods, by then, have reached the Caribbean through indigenous trade chains. The shock advantage that defined the actual conquest of the Americas simply does not exist. The first Spaniards are met by people who have already heard rumors of strangers from the sea. Some are afraid, some are curious, none are paralyzed. By the time Cortez lands at Veracruz in 1519, the Aztecs have had 40 years of contact with the Ming. They have purchased steel weapons, copies of Chinese siege engines, primitive but real inoculation against smallpox. Cortez does not conquer this empire. He probably does not even land. The expedition turns back, or is destroyed, or is allowed to limp home with a warning. Mexico stays Mexican. In this world, that means Aztec. Move forward another century. By 1600, the Ming Dynasty is straining. In our timeline, the Manchu invasion ends it in 1644. In this timeline, the wealth flowing in from American trade buys the Ming an extra century. Different pressures, different reforms, a different fall. European powers still cross the Atlantic. They reach the Caribbean and Brazil. But the western half of the Americas is inside a Chinese trade network they cannot easily break. Mexico stays sovereign. Peru perhaps never falls. The Atlantic slave trade still happens because European sugar plantations still exist in the Caribbean. But it is smaller. The plantation system never expands into a depopulated continent because the continent is never depopulated. What about technology? This is where it gets interesting. Chinese gunpowder reaches the Americas earlier and through different hands. Indigenous states adopt firearms in the 1500s, not the 1700s. By the time European armies push inland, native armies are already armed. Meanwhile, American crops still cross to the Old World, but through Chinese ships first. Maize, potatoes, and chilies arrive in China and Southeast Asia a century earlier than in our timeline. Chinese agriculture booms. The population explodes. Europe gets these crops too, eventually, but later and more expensively. The Italian tomato sauce, the Irish potato, the Spanish paprika, all of it arrives a century behind schedule. The European population in this world is smaller in 1800 than ours. The Industrial Revolution is also delayed. The textile boom that powered Britain in our timeline depended on cotton plantations in a colonized South. Without that scale, the British factory system grows slower and shifts somewhere else. Maybe Bengal, maybe China itself. By 1900, this world looks very different from ours. There are still empires. There is still inequality. There is still industrialized war. But the center of gravity of the global economy is the Pacific, not the Atlantic. Mandarin, not Spanish, is the most common second language in the Americas. The borders we know do not exist. The United States, as a single English-speaking country coast to coast, almost certainly does not happen. The continent is a patchwork of indigenous states, Chinese trade ports, and European footholds. Christianity becomes one tradition among many in the Americas, not the dominant one. Buddhist temples sit alongside Aztec sun temples. Catholic missions exist, but they argue rather than command. Plurality, not conquest, is the default. And the great moral catastrophes of our timeline, the wholesale destruction of indigenous American civilizations, the industrial-scale Atlantic slave trade, do not happen in the same shape. Many things still go wrong. Empires still kill. But the specific catastrophes that defined modernity look smaller. Now the harder, honest question. Is this world better? In some clear ways, yes. Fewer indigenous deaths, slower colonization, more cultural exchange, real diplomatic respect rather than annihilation. A world map that includes voices we erased. But in other ways, less obvious ones, it might be worse. A delayed industrial revolution means delayed medicine, delayed sanitation, delayed mass literacy. The technologies that lifted billions of people out of poverty in the 20th century arrive a generation or two late. And the Ming, in this timeline, are not gentle saints. They are an empire. They demand tribute. They suppress local resistance when it inconveniences them. Indigenous Americans are not free in some perfect sense. They are simply not erased. There is a difference. Both matter. And of course, history does not stop. Wars still happen. Diseases still spread. New empires still rise. By the year 2000 in this timeline, Pacific tensions look different from Atlantic ones, but they are real. The world is still broken. It is just broken in a different shape. Step back from all of it. The single thing this thought experiment is actually about is contingency. In our world, 3 Spanish caravels reached a Caribbean island in October 1492, and the entire shape of the modern era followed from that one landing. But 30 years before that, 300 Chinese treasure ships were already sailing the Indian Ocean. Bigger, better armed, better supplied. The only reason they did not also reach the Americas is that an emperor died, and a faction inside one government decided the sea was not worth it. If that decision had gone the other way, the modern world would not be unrecognizable. It would just be a different version of itself. Different borders, different languages, different capitals, different sins, different heroes, the same humans, walking through a different doorway. And that is the lesson worth carrying out of this. The world we live in is not on rails. It never was. The borders, the languages, the wealth, the wounds, almost none of it was guaranteed. It is just the timeline where one fleet sailed and another one was burned. Which means the world being built right now is not on rails either. The choices being made this century, about who we trade with, who we listen to, who we recognize as fully human, are the same kind of choices those Ming officials were making in 1433. One of them is going to define what someone 500 years from now imagines as their alternative history. Thanks for spending the last few minutes in this other timeline. If this kind of thought experiment is your thing, there will be more. Different turning points, different ships, different mornings where everything almost went another way. Until then, stay curious about the world you actually live in. Thanks for watching Inverted Worlds.